In the year 1206, a man named Temujin united the Mongol tribes and became Genghis Khan. 53 years later, his empire stretched further than Rome's ever had, further than any empire in human history has ever stretched, before or since. And then, in the space of about 60 years, it tore itself apart. Not because an enemy finally found a way to beat them on the battlefield, because of something the Mongols built into their own system from the very beginning, something that made them unstoppable, and at the exact same time, was quietly guaranteeing they could never last. Here's the strange part. The thing that broke the Mongol Empire wasn't a weakness anyone could see from the outside. Their armies didn't weaker. Their tactics didn't get worse. Right up until the moment everything started to unravel, Mongol horsemen were still the most feared soldiers on earth, capable of riding hundreds of miles in a matter of days and striking cities that had no idea they were even under threat. So what actually happened? To understand that, you have to go back to a decision Genghis Khan made about his own family, a decision that seemed completely reasonable at the time, that even looked like a strength for the first few decades, and that would end up costing more lives than almost any battle the Mongols ever fought. Genghis Khan never intended his empire to be ruled by one man forever. According to Mongol custom, the empire wasn't a state that belonged to a nation. It was property that belonged to a family. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his lands were split among his sons, Jochi's territory passing to Jochi's own sons since Jochi had died first, then Chagatai, then Ajidai, then Tolui, each receiving a portion, called a Ulis, to rule as his own. Above all of them sat a single great Khan, chosen not by inheritance in the way a European crown passed from father to eldest son, but by a Kurultai, a council of Mongol princes and generals who gathered to select the man they believed most fit to lead. On paper, this looked like a strength. It meant the Mongols were, in theory, always led by whoever the elite considered strongest, not whoever happened to be born first. For a while, it worked exactly that way. Ogedei was elected in 1229 and kept the conquest moving into Russia and Eastern Europe. But when Ajidai died in 1241, the council needed 2 years just to agree on his successor. When that successor, Goyuk, died only 2 years into his reign, the empire went looking for a great Khan again. Every single time the throne opened up, the entire machine of conquest ground to a halt while Mongol princes, spread across a territory that touched 2 oceans, argued over who deserved to lead it. By 1251, a new great Khan finally brought the empire back together. His name was Mongke, a grandson of Genghis Khan through Tolui, and under him the Mongols found their focus again. Mongke sent his brother Hulagu west to finish off what remained of the Islamic world. He sent another brother, Kublai, to help subdue southern China. For 8 years, Mongke held the whole sprawling machine in one fist. And this is where the story needs to slow down, because what happened to Mongke personally is the hinge that everything else swings on. In 1258, while Hulagu's army was busy destroying Baghdad and ending 5 centuries of Abbasid rule, Mongke was leading his own campaign against the Southern Song dynasty in China, determined to finish the conquest his grandfather had started decades earlier. He besieged a fortress called Diaoyu on a hill above the Yangtze River, defended by Song soldiers who refused every demand to surrender. And the siege dragged on far longer than anyone in the Mongol camp expected. Sometime in the summer of 1259, Mongke died there. The exact cause isn't settled. Some sources point to dysentery spreading through the camp, others to wounds sustained during the siege itself. But what's certain is that the great Khan of the largest empire on earth died outside a fortress he never managed to capture, roughly 50 years old, with no named successor and 2 ambitious brothers thousands of miles apart who both believed the throne should be theirs. A siege that should have been a footnote in the story of the Song dynasty's slow collapse instead became the single event that unraveled the entire Mongol world, because of who happened to be standing outside that fortress when he died. News of Mongke's death took months to reach the far edges of the empire, and it traveled at exactly the worst possible moment. Hulagu was in Syria, his army pressing toward Egypt. the last independent Muslim power left standing between the Mongols and total domination of the Islamic world. When word reached him that his brother had died without an heir, Hulagu made a decision that would look, in hindsight, like the single costliest command of his career. He turned around. He pulled the bulk of his army east, back toward Mongolia and Persia, to protect his own claim to power and see how the succession would be settled. He left behind a much smaller force in the Levant, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 men, under the command of a general named Kitbuka. It was this thinned-out, isolated garrison, not the full weight of the Mongol war machine, that marched into a valley in Galilee called Ain Jalut in September of 1260 and met the army of the Egyptian Mamluks. Kitbuka killed. His force was annihilated. And for the first time since Genghis Khan had united the steppe more than 50 years earlier, a Mongol army had been decisively beaten on an open battlefield. Here's what almost nobody watching from Cairo or Damascus understood in that moment. Ain Jalut wasn't really a story about Mamluk tactics beating Mongol tactics, although the Mamluks fought brilliantly, using their own mounted archers and a feigned retreat into hilly terrain to draw Kitbuka's cavalry into a trap eerily similar to the tactics the Mongols themselves had perfected. It was a story about what happens to an army when the political system behind it starts to buckle. The Mongols hadn't been defeated because they were suddenly worse soldiers. They'd been defeated because their own succession crisis had already pulled their best troops off the board before the battle even started. There's a bitter irony sitting underneath all of it too. The Mamluk army that beat them was itself built almost entirely on a different kind of meritocracy. Boys taken from the steppe and the Caucasus as slaves, trained from childhood in mounted warfare, promoted purely on skill until the most capable among them could rise to command armies or even seize the throne. It was, in its own way, a mirror of the very quality that had once made the Mongols unstoppable. And that crisis inside the Mongol world was only getting started. Back east, the fight over Mongol's throne had turned into exactly what the Kurultai system was supposed to prevent: open war between brothers. Kublai in China had himself declared Great Khan by a hastily assembled group of his own supporters. His younger brother Arik Bok, who had been left in charge of the Mongol homeland around Karakoram, while the others were off conquering the world, considered himself the legitimate choice and convened his own, more traditional Kurultai back in Mongolia. For the first time in Mongol history, there were two men simultaneously claiming to be Great Khan of the entire empire, and neither one was willing to step aside. What followed was 4 years of civil war, Mongol armies fighting Mongol armies, cavalry trained by the same masters, using the same tactics that had terrorized 3 continents, now turning those tactics on each other. Arik Bok tried to starve Kublai's forces out by cutting off grain supplies to Mongolia. Kublai, controlling the richer agricultural regions of northern China, simply outlasted him. In 1264, Arik Bok finally surrendered at Kublai's court in Shangdu. Some accounts suggest he died within 2 years, possibly poisoned, though the sources on this point are not conclusive enough to state as settled fact. Kublai had won, and the other Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, eventually acknowledged him as Great Khan rather than risk more open war. But acknowledgement on paper wasn't the same thing as obedience in practice. None of them sent troops when Kublai called for them. None of them coordinated policy with him in any meaningful way ever again. The empire he'd won had already stopped acting like a single empire, and the crack that opened during those 4 years of civil war was never fully repaired. While that war for the throne was tearing through the Mongol heartland, an entirely different, equally devastating conflict was breaking out 2,000 miles to the west, and it traces directly back to Baghdad. Berk, Khan of the Golden Horde in Russia and a grandson of Genghis Khan, had converted to Islam years earlier, becoming the first Mongol ruler to embrace the faith. When news reached him of what Hulagu had done to Baghdad, the wholesale slaughter, the execution of the caliph, the burning of the great library, Berk did not respond with the neutral pragmatism the empire's founders might have expected of him. According to sources close to the events, Berke declared that Hulagu had sacked the cities of the Muslims and killed the caliph, and that he intended to hold him accountable for so much innocent blood. He is also recorded as lamenting that Mongols were now killing each other with Mongol swords, and that unity might have let them conquer the entire world. It's a striking line, whether or not it's word for word what Berke actually said, because it captures the exact moment the empire's own participants realized what was happening to them. Berke didn't at words. He allied himself with the very Mamluks who had just destroyed Kit Buka's army at Ain Jalut, exchanging embassies and coordinating against their common enemy, Hulagu. He backed Arik Bok's claim to the throne against Kublai, and in 1262, he sent an army south under his nephew Nogai to strike directly at Hulagu's territory in the Caucasus. Early skirmishes went in the Golden Horde's favor before Hulagu's forces rallied and pushed Nogai back. Then, in the depths of winter, Hulagu pursued Berke's retreating army north across the frozen Terek River, and disaster followed him. According to the sources describing the campaign, the ice gave way beneath his own advancing troops, and large numbers of Hulagu's soldiers drowned in the freezing water, forcing him to abandon the pursuit and pull back in disarray. It was, by any measure, the first sustained, large-scale war fought entirely between Mongols and Mongols, and it meant Hulagu could never gather the strength to march back into Syria and avenge Kit Buka's death at Ain Jalut, the way he had planned. The Mamluks, who had every reason to expect a second, far larger Mongol invasion, simply never got one. Not because they'd broken Mongol power, because the Mongols were now too busy fighting themselves. So by the mid-1260s, barely a decade after Monkey's death, the picture looked like this. Kublai controlled China and had crushed his own brother to get there. Hulagu's descendants held Persia and the Middle East, permanently at war with their own cousins in Russia. The Golden Horde under Berke controlled the Western Steppe and had allied itself with the Mongols' former enemies against its own relatives. A fourth branch, the Chagatai Khanate, held Central Asia and drifted into its own separate orbit. 4 Khanates. 4 rival power centers, all descended from the same grandfather, all trained in the same tactics, all now treating each other as the more immediate threat than the outside world. The empire that had once moved as a single terrifying weapon was now 4 smaller weapons, occasionally pointed at each other. You'd think a story about an empire tearing itself apart from the inside would end there. It doesn't. Because the two things that made the Mongols the most fearsome conquerors in the medieval world, their mastery of horse and open ground, and the vast, connected trading network their conquests had accidentally stitched together across Eurasia, were about to turn on them in ways nobody could have predicted. Start with the horses. Everything about Mongol military success was built around the open steppe, dry ground, wide plains where cavalry could maneuver, feint, encircle, and strike without warning. It's what made them unbeatable from Korea to Hungary. It's also exactly what they didn't have when Kublai Khan, now ruling China as founder of the Yuan dynasty, decided he wanted Japan. In 1274, Kublai sent a fleet of several hundred ships and somewhere around 30,000 to 40,000 men across the Korea Strait. They landed, fought hard against fierce samurai resistance near Hakata Bay, and then a typhoon tore into the anchored fleet, sinking roughly a third of the ships and drowning an estimated 13,000 men. 7 years later, in 1281, Kublai tried again, this time with a genuinely staggering force. More than 4,000 vessels and well over 100,000 soldiers and sailors, the largest seaborne invasion the medieval world had ever seen. The Japanese had spent the intervening years building stone walls along the likely landing beaches. The Mongol fleet, unable to find anywhere to put its army ashore, sat offshore for weeks, its supplies dwindling, its crews increasingly desperate. Then another typhoon struck, and this one was catastrophic. At least half the Mongol force drowned. Nearly the entire fleet was destroyed. The Japanese called the storms kamikazes, the divine wind, and treated the survival of their islands as an act of the gods. Modern geological research, sediment cores pulled from lake beds near the invasion site, has actually confirmed that unusually powerful typhoons really did strike Kyushu in both 1274 and 1281, matching the historical accounts almost exactly. But here's the detail that gets lost in the drama of the storms. Historians who've studied the campaigns closely point out that both invasions were already in deep trouble before the weather turned. The fleets were crewed largely by conscripted Korean and Chinese sailors who had little personal stake in Kublai's ambitions and every reason to want the campaign over quickly. The Japanese stone walls had already denied the invaders a beachhead in 1281 weeks before the typhoon arrived, forcing tens of thousands of men to sit crammed aboard ships for months, eating through supplies, with nowhere to land and nowhere to retreat to. An army built entirely around cavalry warfare on dry land, an army that had learned to live off captured grain and open pasture from Hungary to northern China, had no answer for an enemy protected by open water. And the storms simply confirmed what was already becoming true before a single wave hit the fleet. The single most effective military machine in the medieval world had a blind spot exactly the width of the sea, and it cost them what would have been the crown jewel of Kublai's Eastern Empire. Now for the second turn, the one that's almost invisible until you know to look for it, and the one that connects directly back to the very success the Mongols were proudest of. When Genghis Khan and his successors conquered their way across Eurasia, they didn't just destroy things. They built something too, a network of protected trade routes, way stations, and relay systems stretching from China to the Black Sea, so secure and so well policed that merchants and travelers moved along it more safely than at almost any other point in history. Historians call this period the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, and it's usually told as the empire's proudest legacy, the reason Marco Polo could travel from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan and back again. Goods, ideas, and people moved across the continent faster and more freely than ever before. So did disease. Somewhere in the grasslands of Central Asia, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis had been living quietly in wild rodent populations for a very long time. What changed in the 13th and 14th centuries was the road. The same relay stations and trade caravans that let a Venetian merchant reach Beijing also let infected fleas, and the rodents that carried them travel a network that had never before been so open or so continuous. In 1345 and again in 1346, Johnny Beg, Khan of the Golden Horde and a great-great-grandson of Genghis Khan, laid siege to the Genoese trading post of Kaffa on the Black Sea, only to watch plague tear through his own army faster than his siege engines could break the walls. One contemporary account, written by a notary named Gabriel de Musi, who was not actually present at the siege, claims Johnny Beg's forces catapulted infected corpses over the walls in a deliberate act of biological warfare. Modern historians are genuinely divided on whether that specific detail is accurate. Some argues would likely no longer have been contagious by they were thrown, and it may simply have been infected rats and fleas moving from the Mongol camp into the city on their own. But there's no serious dispute that was already moving through the region along Mongol-controlled trade corridors, and that Genoese merchants fleeing Kaffa by ship carried it directly into Mediterranean ports, and from there into the heart of Europe. The disease that would come to be called the Black Death killed an estimated 50 million people in Europe between 1346 and 1352. It killed millions more across Asia and North Africa in the years before and after, and it hit the Mongol Khanates themselves with brutal force. It killed rulers. It killed elites. It gutted the populations of the trading cities the Mongols depended on to fund their armies and administrations. Johnny Beg himself survived the siege of Kaffa and went on ruling for another decade, but in 1307, not long after returning from a successful campaign in Azerbaijan, he died suddenly, quite possibly murdered by his own son. The son, Berdy Beg, inherited a golden horde that was already hollowing out, its great trading cities losing population as fast as the plague could take them, its treasury shrinking as the caravans that used to fund it grew too dangerous to run. Berdy Beg lasted barely 2 years before he too was gone. In the 21 years that followed, Something like 25 different Khans cycled through the throne of the Golden Horde, a period Mongol chroniclers themselves came to call the Bulghak, the Great Confusion. According to historian Christopher Beckwith, the plague weakened Mongol military strength and crippled local economies across the Khanates just as badly as it devastated Europe. Trade along the Silk Road, the very artery that had made the Mongol economic system possible, became too dangerous to use, and traffic collapsed. The empire's greatest achievement, the thing that had connected the known world more completely than any power before it, become the delivery system for the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. And the Mongols were not spared from what they had helped set in motion. Piece all of this together and you start to see the actual shape of what destroyed the Mongol Empire, and it's almost nothing like the story most people know. It wasn't a rival army that finally matched Mongol tactics on an open battlefield, though the Mamluks at Ain Jalut certainly proved that Mongol soldiers could bleed and die like anyone else. It wasn't simple overextension, an empire too big to hold, though the sheer size of the territory certainly made everything harder. The deeper truth is that almost every catastrophe that unraveled the Mongol world grew directly out of the exact systems that had made the Mongols great in the first place. Their succession model, built to always put the strongest man on the throne rather than merely the eldest son, produced instead a permanent cycle of crisis and civil war every time a great Khan died. Because there was no agreed mechanism to settle disputes peacefully, only the threat of force. Their cavalry, unmatched on land from Hungary to Korea, ran straight into the one kind of terrain, open water, it had no way to master. And their trading network, the genuine wonder of the medieval world, the thing that let philosophy and paper money and gunpowder move faster across Eurasia than ever before, carried a plague bacterium along with everything else, and struck down the very people who had built it. By 1368, Kublai's Yuan dynasty had lost its grip on China entirely, driven out by the rebellion that founded the Ming dynasty, a little over 3 decades after Kublai's own death. The Golden Horde, weakened by plague and endless infighting, slowly lost territory to a rising Russian principality centered on Moscow, the very state its Khans had once treated as a tributary, and would eventually be defeated by Moscow's own forces at the end of the 15th century. The Ilkhanate in Persia dissolved into competing local dynasties within a generation of the Black Death's arrival, its territory carved up by successor states with no real claim to Genghis Khan's bloodline. Only the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia lingered on in fragmented form for a while longer, eventually giving rise to new powers that would shape the region in different ways entirely. The empire that had once stretched unbroken from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna simply was not there anymore, not as one thing. It had not been conquered from the outside, not in any single decisive campaign, the way it had conquered so much of the world itself. It had come apart from decisions and systems built into its own foundation, decades before anyone, Mongol or otherwise, could see the cracks forming. What's left, if you go looking for it, isn't really a story about a barbarian empire finally getting what was coming to it. It's a story about what happens to any system, any organization, any structure of power that solves the problem of getting strong without ever solving the much harder problem of staying whole. The Mongols conquered more of the Earth's surface than anyone in history, and they did it in barely 2 generations. And in less time than that, they proved that the very qualities that let them conquer the world, a merit-based path to power with no fixed rules for succession, an unmatched mastery of one specific kind of warfare, an open network built for speed and reach, were never actually separate from the reasons it eventually broke. They were the same thing, viewed from 2 different points in time. There's a version of this story where the villain is obvious, a rival army that finally found the courage and the skill to stand up to the Mongols, or a plague that struck them down through no fault of their own. The real version is less comfortable than that, and probably more useful. The Mongols weren't undone by an enemy who outfought them. They were undone by the exact same forces that had made them the most feared power on Earth. A system for choosing leaders that rewarded strength over stability, a style of warfare that had never needed to answer for its blind spots. and a network built for speed that never asked what else might travel along with the silk and the spices. None of it looked like a weakness while the empire was still winning. It only looked they afterward. So here's the question worth sitting with. If the very things that make an empire, or a company, or a system unstoppable are so often the same things that eventually tear it apart, what do you think the Mongols could have actually differently? And does anything really solve that problem? Or is it just the price every empire eventually pays for getting big enough to matter? Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you want more stories like this one, subscribe for what's coming next.